to discuss with the Minnesota Real ID Act taking effect this week, the Kavanaugh testimonies going on, and then the Allianz Stadium is going to be opening later this month. But before we get into that, we're going to take a look at this week's headlines.
So this week I visited the homeless encampment, Tent City, that is in Minneapolis, and it's the Wall of Forgotten Natives, as it's been written and called. But people are overdosing on heroin that is laced with fentanyl out there, and Pamela Rivera has just passed away, and it's the third death now. And I'm following this story because I'm interested in how addiction is intersecting with homelessness, and how do you really tackle this issue, and what is the best way to tackle it first? Do you address the addiction issue first, or do you address the homelessness issue first? Because part of the reason why homelessness is something that I focus on is because it's a basic need. It's right there with food and water. And so if we're talking about addiction, how can we talk about addiction if we aren't first talking about the basic needs that need to be met of the people? So when I'm out and I see people, and you can literally physically see them that they're using, it's like, okay, we can't even talk about that until we get them into like safe and stable housing.
And so this is the encampment that was in South Minneapolis, correct?
Yes, yep, it's off of Hiawatha and Cedar.
Well, and then too, winter is coming.
Winter is coming.
So there's got to be some sort of larger solution soon.
Yeah, sad story.
Something that definitely needs more attention and resources.
Definitely.
That's true. Well, what I've been keeping up with lately is the story about the Minneapolis gas station, CK gas station. It was broken into and set on fire. And the owner says that he actually found hope now because of the Washburn school. The seniors have actually helped and raise money. They did a GoFundMe. They raised $18,000 now dollars to help him out in his store. And I just thought that was just a beautiful way to look at community and how they're just helping out. You know, they go there for school, for lunches. You know, when they don't have enough money to pay for their lunch, they go there for snacks. And, you know, and it's a good hangout spot. They go and they meet the owner, they talk to him, they joke and they kid with him. And it's just awesome to see how they're giving back as well. You know, the store gave to them and now they're like, hey, this is our store. We're going to take control of this. We're going to help them out. And I just thought that that was just an awesome story. I like to hear stories like that.
And how motivating to see our youth doing something so positive. If they have the manpower to raise $18,000, you know, for a gas station, and that's just one high school, you know.
And one class at that
school.
All the students.
Well, another, I think, great story that has come across the headlines this past week is a $50,000 check that was written to the Rondo Avenue Association. And I believe it was given by the St. Paul Association of Realtors. Rondo has encountered so much just in, you know, the last 100 years, you know what I mean? And so to see an organization donate that money specifically to Rondo Avenue Incorporated, that organization is dedicated to revitalizing Rondo Avenue. And so from what I know, they're going to dedicate that $50,000 to renovating New Jerusalem Baptist Church, which has been vacant. And their plan is by next year, after they do all the renovations, they're gonna open it up to have chess lessons, and poetry slams. And so maybe I'm biased because I love both of those things. But just to see them investing in our community and in a way that's going to provide a safe place for our youth to go, and with activities and programming already in mind for them, I think is going to be a really good investment. Yeah. So, and plus, I mean, I'm watching this story because at SPNN we're working on a documentary about Rondo, which premieres in November. So I just have my eyes on all thing Rondo right now. Plus, I grew up there. So. This week, the Minnesota Real ID Act took effect as of October 1st, and I think a lot of people are confused about it.
So this Real ID, right? It's a federal mandate, that basically ups the ante on how we use identification, and particularly for travel, right? For boarding airplanes, domestic and international travel. I think it's presenting some challenges for folks because of the requirements that are necessary for a real ID are a little bit more extensive than those that we would need to actually just get a regular ID or a driver's license. And I think part of the confusion is that Minnesota is one of maybe 5 states that hasn't enforced. So I remember being in the airport and seeing the signs like, you need to make sure that you get your IDs updated. And I've been traveling with my passport because I've been unclear about the timeline myself because initially I believe this was supposed to start maybe like a year ago. And now the timeline for Minnesota and these couple of other states keeps getting pushed forward. So beyond the scope of the things that are necessary in order to get these IDs, I think there's an anxiety around like, what do I know now? What can I travel with now? You know, and what does that mean for like my citizenship, right? You need a birth certificate. I remember there was a time where you needed like to prove your residency, right, to be able to get an ID. But now it's like you need 2 forms of identification. There's always the running joke, right, of like, why do I need ID to get ID? Right. And now you need like twice as much ID to get ID.
Right.
So I understand the confusion. And as someone who's read a little bit about it, I still am traveling with a passport and an ID, and I also recognize the privilege of like having a passport and going through that process, paying for it. Getting a passport is tedious too. And I'm sure it's a different experience, again, depending on one's citizenship or lack thereof or undocumented, like the challenges that it presents for folks. Even when I think about people moving, I mean, it's not interstate, but when I think about some of the experiences I've had with young people when they're first getting their driver's license and they were born in Chicago and they can't get their birth certificate and it takes it's quite a hassle.
Well, and I think that is part of the reason why the federal government is trying to enforce the Real ID Act is because they're trying to make a minimum standard across the country for ID. It's not just airports, it's also military bases or any federal building. I think a lot of it has to do with 9/11 still. But when I lived in Georgia, the requirements to get an ID was very, very different than the requirements in Minnesota. And so I think what this is supposed to do is make a national standard in every state of what the requirements are to obtain identification. In Minnesota, we have been dragging our feet and being compliant. And there was a period where I think Minnesota residents almost totally lost the ability to travel. And so that was extended. It was extended to October 1st, which now has passed. But after looking over everything, I think it's confusing that Real ID in Minnesota goes into effect October 1st, 2018, but you're really not required to have your Minnesota Real ID until 2020. So I get the fact that they want to give people time to transition to the new system, but then it's kind of confusing because then for people who don't have access easily to information, it becomes confusing on whether or not what is their status? Are they valid? Is their ID working right now? And so I think for the average person, you know, they're not going to really see any impact until 2020 if they don't transition over, from what I understand about what's out there. But I think people who are not from here, who don't have citizenship, they're going to have a much different experience transitioning because now there are more requirements to obtain a driver's license. And so I know you deal a lot with immigration, and I'm just wondering, you know, what are you hearing about how this is going to impact immigration?
Well, quite a few people that I know are wondering. You know, some already have their license because they were able to get it other ways, and they're just wondering if that's going to go away for them. And if it does, it's going to impact their lives in a way of work travel, getting their kids to and from school.
and things like that. That's what their main concern is. And just knowing that a lot of them are starting to, pay more with like Uber and stuff, providing transportation for their children, because now that it's getting cold, some of them have to walk miles, because they're afraid to drive, and yeah, that's what they're dealing with right now. So,
when I was first hearing about this, I was curious as to what was taking us so long to get with it. Like, why are we part of the last 5 of the nation who haven't done it yet? So it's because of what's happening during the legislative session. So they're within the House and the Senate, they're talking about what does it take to get identification or to get your driver's license. And it's interesting because this was passed in 2016 and it was held up. And I think that it was because they were saying explicitly that you had to be a US citizen or have a social security number in order to get a driver's license. So like even without the issue of like the convenience of being able to fly, but just like as you were saying, to be able to do like your normal things like get to work or get your kids to school, you still have to have a driver's license in order to do those things. But to say it explicitly that you have to be a US citizen to do it, it becomes like a human rights issue. So now that it's being presented again by the opposite, I think it was first that it was passed by the Senate and now it's being passed by the House. It might be vice versa. But they have removed that language now and is passing it again, which I felt was really interesting because you still implement the policy there that excludes certain people, and I just thought that it was interesting. Like that's how the system becomes racist. That is systemic racism in the making, like in the flesh, real time. So it's just like it's interesting to watch and to see, and it's kind of scary. Because there will be a lot of people who are affected by that. So when you talk, so that ties in then like ICE and immigration, and depending upon what community you come from, like I live in East St. Paul and we have a highly diverse community, and we talk about things like public safety so broadly and vaguely almost, but it's like if this is my community, public safety would be making sure that like they have that safety from being deported or where their kid's going to go. So it's something that is of concern to me because it affects my community directly.
Exactly. Well, and Minnesota in general has a very, very rich population of people of all nationalities. And we might not see the effects now, but in 2020, we're definitely going to feel it. So have any of you ladies been following the Kavanaugh proceedings?
Oh, I had to really take a hard look at myself. It's interesting because my social media timeline is like bogged down with topics of like sexual assault and rape culture, which is really heavy, right? And almost to the point where it's like I want to turn away. And to be honest, I had to check myself. It's like, that is normal. Like, that's not anything new. That's not something that any woman hasn't faced. And I could feel myself kind of brushing it off. I don't want to talk about it, and it's triggering almost. But I really had to check myself as like, just because it is so normal doesn't mean that it's right. And that's pretty much the point, but I feeling myself being caught up and swept in it and really turning the other cheek, not only because I think that it's disgusting and it makes me feel bad and down, but just, it's too much. And choosing to turn away and not paying attention to it is like kind of like the same thing where we talk about any other issue where it's like, well, if you're not a part of the solution.
Because I have kind of, I've heard so much about it, and every time I've went to any news outlet to try to, find out what's going on, it's the first story. Then it's the third story. And so there's all these updates, and it's almost become white noise, like you said, that I've tried to turn the other cheek. And so you're making me feel bad about doing that. Like and then it's because it feels like this whole year has been sexual assault accusation,
Yeah.
sexual assault, trial. It's just been the
Trending.
whole year has been that, politician after politician from a national level to even here in Minnesota, we've seen accusations against our own politicians and lawmakers. And so it is a very serious issue, and I'm glad that it's at the forefront. But it's tough to talk about, and when you see the shame that comes against the accusers that come forward, it makes it, I think, even more difficult for other women to do it. But I'm glad that as a collective, women are finding the courage to talk about it.
And I think it's just so hard too with these certain cases that it's so hard to bring up stuff that happened years ago. Like, it's like, how do you even remember every detail, or it's hard for them to even remember the details, but they remember how they felt.
Right.
And they're like, look, no, I gotta get this off of me. And I'm glad that the women have the courage to even step forward and talk about it and let them know that, like, this is wrong, even though it did happen long ago. Hey, I have to get this off of me, and to be able to share the story, to let them know that, it's not, it shouldn't be happening. So.
And I think that's where healing begins,
Right.
and it's a way to start to break the cycle.
Exactly.
So yes, it is white noise. Yes, it is every day. It is
Right.
the norm, but it shouldn't be. So even 50 years later, addressing it is still, and healing for them too, and
Necessary for them.
their children, all the women around them, and people who they've never even met before.
Well, and then think too, how many women who have had these experiences suppress their own emotions about their own experiences. And so in some sense, I think it's healing for women who won't speak up ever, but for them to face what they've gone through and acknowledge that something wrong happened to them, and hopefully to seek some type of therapy, to process what happened to them.
I think it's really complex. I think there are good reasons to turn away. I think there are good reasons to pay attention. I think there are larger issues at stake in terms of, how does a culture get to a place where this becomes this consistent and this public, this visual, like we can, visceral. And some folks do become apathetic. Other folks utilize their agency around, how do we want to engage with this as an issue? Those of us who have had personal experiences with assault, sexual assault, harassment. I mean, I think there's a larger conversation around how do we get to this point, right? Because the low-level street harassment that's unchecked eventually becomes worse.
The moral degrade.
We've seen women be harassed in the street, in the club, be assaulted, physically assaulted, sexually assaulted. We're talking about a person who is a Supreme Court nominee. He's taking in one of the highest seats in the land. And and this is a very public conversation. And there are still folks who are like, I can't believe this is happening. It's possible that he didn't do anything. Why the same question of like, why did she wait? Why did she do this? Why did she do that? What are we focusing on the victim? That it takes an incredible amount of courage to tell your truth, whatever that truth is. And I just think with the saturation of media and news and like the trial, like there are somatic, there are physiological responses that I think all of us are having, whether you've been victimized or not, whether you've been a perpetrator or not. Like our human response is to feel like something about that, and or about how this issue is like being managed, about what parts of it are being talked about in the media, what parts are on display. What does it mean, like these larger networks of like solidarity among women, and then even the intersections around like which women and what community and how these women identify.
Exactly.
Class, like race, gender, all of those things are important, and I think it's harder for us to have a larger conversation because then we, one, have to deal with whatever baggage we're carrying, but two, we get to a point where we really have to utilize our agency and say like, but what about it? Like, I don't want to be in this position again 15 years from now,
Yeah,
talking to one of
right.
my children
Yeah.
or daughters
Yeah.
about, well, 15 years ago, we were having this same conversation.
Well, and actually, when you look at it,
And
with Clarence Thomas, we
right,
were
right.
having
In the
this
same
conversation. So
conversation.
it's pretty much history repeating itself. But in that context, it was very different because I believe race played a factor. The nominee was African American. The woman who accused him was African American. And so I think that's been a subtopic of this whole process. Is, you know, with Clarence Thomas, I think people looked at Anita Hill. From what I've read, the popular opinion was people didn't believe her because she was an African American woman. And so then now you have a white nominee and you have a white accuser, and it seems like the majority is more sympathetic to Christine. And so, you know, I had not listened to her testimony. I went last night and I listened to her testimony in full. And, you know, this might not be the popular thought on this issue, but I was kind of forced to ask myself, you know, this was something that happened in high school, you know, and so you were talking decades ago. And not that it makes it that it's not relevant. I think the conversation would be different if Kavanaugh would take some ownership. He's had classmates who have come forward and who have said that he's lied under oath about different things. And so I think it's one thing when someone makes an accusation towards you, and if it is true, if you take ownership of it and you handle it in a truthful manner, especially when you're in a position to be nominated for the
Right.
Supreme Court, and you're gonna be over law. And that's basically the main principle of your industry.
Right.
It's truth and justice.
And
Exactly.
integrity.
Right.
Your character. Yeah.
But then there's this other component where when we look at ourselves and things that we did in high school, I'm sure we've all done things that we're not proud of. And so, you know, at what point do these mistakes, I've made mistakes, even in adulthood, that I'm not proud of, that I don't want to haunt me forever. You know, and so I think that there should be a platform for victims. I think that there should be accountability. You know, and if there was any way for, if it did happen, it was true, I mean, they really only know it in God. But, you know, is there a way to redeem yourself from something that you did in high school?
Right. Because
You
like,
know?
how do you judge that now? You know, like, what are you going to put him in juvenile, like for something he did? You know, or you know, or how do you judge that? So yeah, I see where you're coming from with that point, and yeah, it's very difficult. It's a difficult situation. So I mean, you have to judge it, and his character is playing a good part in this. Seeing how he handles himself in court.
Yep.
You know, you don't want to come off as a prick or rude,
Yep.
and you're trying to be a judge.
Insensitive.
Like, how are you handling this right now? We need. I mean, like. So I just.
But this is how rape culture permeates, though. Like this idea that there's a timeline on the type of grief or the process that one goes through when they've experienced a sexual assault or any kind of assault, but in this particular case, a sexual assault, that isn't necessarily in alignment with a political timeline, isn't necessarily in alignment with a social timeline in terms of like, well, I just think it's really, it gets very, very touchy.
Right.
And again, I think it's actually easier for us if we start thinking about some of these larger issues, because I think the more that we zoom in and the more we focus, the more that we see, right? Just like being in front of a camera. And so I think that culturally it's important for us to figure out in terms of process moving forward, what is it that we're trying to create for the future? And what type of spaces and platforms are necessary, what types of processes, transformative justice, which is like a huge thing in different parts of the country where folks are redeveloping or reimagining, like how do we deal with these interpersonal violence in a way that doesn't throw people away.
Right.
But also in a way that holds people accountable, in a way that redefines how we determine what it means to be safe, because what I think is safe might be different from what you think is safe, from what she thinks is safe. And so for me, it's a quite delicate But I don't think there's any point, me personally, where as long as we're alive on this planet, where one cannot be accountable for something
their
that they did.
actions.
Whether
Right.
it's like self-forgiveness, or if you feel like you've done something that has caused harm, because all of us have caused harm,
Right.
that inside of these transformative justice processes, or inside of this process or conversation, is there some time frame, or is there an opportunity for when people who have done harm are able to come forward and say, like, I did this thing that was very harming? Because I also feel like Kavanaugh discussed me, but also there are people around him, per this person who testified on his behalf in court, who are also encouraging and supporting him not being accountable for this behavior, that he has a political stake in not being accountable. I'm sure he has a monetary stake in not being accountable.
Right.
So it's a really important question, and there's nuance, but also the reality is that what are we invested in? Are we invested in, like, the media, like watching it and feeling this kind of sickness, or are we invested in developing these processes, or can it be both?
Well, and then even too, looking at a high school boy and a high school girl, and looking at culturally the behavior norms, is this type of behavior normal? And just really processing if our country has kind of declined morally over the generations, and how far is that going to go? And I feel like this is a conversation that we can be elaborated on in so many different angles, but it's something that we're going to have to continue to watch how it plays out. Is he going to get nominated? Or is this going to prevent him from being nominated? So it will be interesting to see how it plays out, and Selah, like you said, how it impacts transformative justice across the country. But it's definitely something that we've seen trend even here in Minnesota with our own politicians. And so it's an issue that has to be confronted, that we can no longer, and I'm guilty of it myself, look at as white noise. We just can't.
Well, shout out to courage. I just say
Absolutely.
that. Shout out to
Shout
courage.
out.
Yeah.
'Cause it
Absolutely.
takes-
Well, the Allianz Stadium is opening October 21st. I've been watching.
Yeah, it's like 2
I feel like
weeks.
I've just been like slowly watching the progression of the construction.
Yeah, I really, I don't even know what to say about this. I'm all for the stadium. I'm glad, they're making one. It's just where it's at. Why there? I've spoken to, I'm around here frequently, and I've spoken to business owners there, and I've asked them, how is this impacting? Like, they're like, it's such an odd spot to put, and their sales have already started going down, because of parking spaces, and how they used to have this wide space, and now it's very, very limited, and so I just think that honestly, it's going to have a negative impact in a way, as far as, traffic. Traffic is a big issue right now in that area, and time, and like I said, I think it's definitely going to have an impact on small businesses around, around there, but that's my opinion.
Like small businesses in that area, this is like their second wave of development that is coming. And when you say like why right there, but I mean it's like the number one thing with like real estate is like location, 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 and where you put something is critical to what the success or its viability is going to be. So the businesses that are there have already like weathered the storm of the light rail coming, and
Well, and prior to that, 94.
right. So
94 was not always there.
right. So historically, it's like hitting it and hitting it again, and what that community looks like, and every time I drive past the stadium, it's always like this like doom, like dun dun dun.
It looks like a huge UFO.
It's all this steel and everything. And I was just driving past the other day, and I was like, I went to high school right across the street. We
Yes,
went to
we did.
we went to high school right across the street, and I'm like, we were at Foot Locker, we were at Cub, we were at the McDonald's, whatever. There's the
bowling
Perkins there.
alley.
The bowling alley is gone. So that memory is like just simply that. And I think that the relevance of a soccer stadium, it matters. We have a large population of people who play soccer and who are like into that. And I think that it is good, but what does it mean, again, for the small businesses? What does it mean for the small businesses of color? You know, the people who have made it so that they're successful and lasted, especially if they've been there for a long time. And who is going to be able to afford the rents moving forward?
Exactly.
Yeah, it's going to be able to afford that. And I've looked into that too, and I've seen that people have already been moving in because of the stadium.
Right.
You know, soccer fans.
They renamed the apartments on St. Anthony. I actually used to live in these apartments, St. Anthony and Snelling, right there across the street.
Yeah.
They renamed them Stadium View Apartments.
Wow.
It's already happening.
Thank you. Took the word right out.
Crazy.
You'll see it as a selling point, like, oh, come move to
yeah,
Stadium
property
View
value's going
apartment.
up, yeah.
Appointment
Right across from this.
steps away from the gleaming new stadium.
And light rail, yeah.
Yeah.
It's going to be on there.
But is it's wintertime sports, right? I mean, and I don't. Is it going to be open? I'm probably not going to be sitting up there in the middle of December.
Well, you know, so it kind of, it's a little frustrating when you see a city taking on a project. In May, they were projecting the cost of this was going to be $250 million.
Wow.
So you have a $250 million project, and granted, this may be coming from private investors. I don't know where the funding's coming from, but then you have a homeless encampment.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
We could
You
move them
know.
to the stadium.
Right? It will seat 19,000 people, so I'm sure there will be plenty of room. But, you know, I question kind of larger scales because change, although some people are going to be displaced and it's going to impact them negatively, there's going to be other ways where our community will benefit and strive from it. And so change is a lot about adaptation. You know, but for me, just like growing up in that neighborhood, I went to church right across the street, and so I wonder how they had an amazing youth ministry that, you know, they would go to Central High School and they would get a lot of the young men there to come in every Wednesday night and just play basketball and feed them, and they got a lot of kids off the street, and you can see them now as adult men and fathers and how they're participating and giving back into their community. And so I wonder, how is that ministry going to be impacted? It's right across the street. Snelling Avenue is already one of the most traveled roads, if not the most traveled road in the entire city of St. Paul. So now you're going to be dumping, if the stadium seats 19,000 people, how much more traffic is that going to be? And so what I was told was the entrance to the stadium is going to be on Hamlin, and all of the signage is going to route people to exit Hamlin to try to avoid some of that congestion. But we know how congested it gets for the state fair.
Right.
Yeah,
Imagine, I truly hope there's never a soccer event happening at the same time as the state fair. Because unless you're walking, you won't be able to get there. Not on Snelling Avenue. So that's going to be crazy. But you know, just to see all the businesses, especially like the bowling alley displaced, and you know, every time we would drive by, we'd see the developments. You know, we kind of just asked ourselves, so are they going to keep that building up? Is this business going to leave? How long is this business going to be there? And so we were able to reach out to Tim Wilson. He owns Urban Lights right there on University and Hamlin Avenue, and we were able to just, you know, kind of pick his brain. He's been there for decades, and ask him, how does he feel that the stadium will impact his business?
I mean, we found out they had very few community meetings, but again, you know, people probably should be more involved, so there probably was more stuff going on that we just didn't know about or whatever. But we found out basically when they broke ground that they were building the stadium. Initial thoughts, it's ridiculous because soccer has, you know, not thrived in Minneapolis 2 or 3 times. So this time it's going to be the charm, I guess. So we'll see. But what you're seeing is gentrification at its finest.
Well, gentrification definitely is a factor. So some of the work that I've done is within Frogtown Neighborhood Association and the Wilder Square Cooperative, which is predominantly Black and African-owned co-op. So people own shares, and it's extremely affordable housing. But there is an entity who shall remain nameless who is trying to buy it pretty much like from under them. And it's extremely valuable, and it's valuable because of all the development that's happening around it. And really, it's funny, but they do use those type of like fluff language, like minutes away from the Green Line, 20 minutes from both downtowns, you know what I mean? Those kind of things. You access to each stadium, you know, we got a stadium at either end and now in the middle, and these are all selling points, and that parcel of land, there was a high-rise building that sold for like $2 million, and then 3 years later, now it's worth almost $8 million. And that comes with all the development, which increases the rents, and then the community that's been there forever, suffering through the construction and all of that, paying the taxes, or however that goes, all of a sudden can't live in their own hood no more. So it makes me feel some type of way. That's something that's like extremely close to my heart, especially because housing is one of those things. It's like we all need housing. I don't care who you are, what you're a part of, what issues you deal with. Everybody needs a safe and healthy place to live. Period.
And it's a basic human right.
Exactly. It becomes a human rights issue. And when you really start unpacking and you look at what communities are affected the most, and I was like, I don't understand how it's not a civil rights issue also. So.
Absolutely. Well, and then to see Urban Lights, I mean, that's just been a gem. How many record stores can you say have survived through the digital era?
Exactly.
Most record stores, as soon as MP3s and, you know, the iPods and everything came, a lot of the record stores went out of business. So to see Tim Wilson still in business, survive through that, survive through the train, you know, and now to see this other obstacle, I'm sure he'll survive. But you know, it's just, it's tough to see people who you know in your own community impacted. And in the broader scale, I think I was trying to say earlier, you know, there's two sides to everything. So when we're looking at change, there's this side, like you said, with the gentrification, people are getting pushed out. That's the cost of having the stadium. But I wonder if the people who came up with the plan are we trying to prepare Minnesota for the Olympics? I mean, we just had the Super Bowl.
That's not the first time
We
I've
just
heard
had the
that.
Super Bowl, and so I know that I don't know what the requirements are, but I know that there's some type of requirement for how many stadiums, arenas that you have, because they have to host different events. And so when I saw that up, that was the first thing that came to my mind was, are we trying to pitch ourselves to be a hosting city of the Olympics, which could be great for Minnesota.
It could, yes.
You know, economically, it could be great, but who benefits from that? Because at some point, you know, you kind of start to see, and being rooted in this community for 20, 30 years, and knowing the Midway when Montgomery Ward's was still there, when Lifetime Fitness was Marvin's, California.
School shopping.
You know, when you see these types of transformations happening decades after decades after decades, but then you just see the people who are on the lower end of the totem pole are disproportionately affected negatively, and then the people who are on the higher end continue to benefit. At some point, you know, the system, it has to balance itself out.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, that's all that we have for today. We appreciate you so much for joining us for this episode of Talk Avenue, and we hope to see you next time.